They used to look straight through me, as if I were part of the wallpaper, or worse, something that didn't quite belong but couldn't be removed. I remember the laughter most clearly. Not loud, not cruel in the obvious way. No, that would have been easier. It was softer, polite, controlled. The kind that slips behind gloved hands and never quite reaches the eyes, and somehow, it was always about me. I wasn't introduced so much as acknowledged, a nod here, a glance there. My name spoken only when necessary, a five like a detail that had to be endured rather than welcomed. I learned very early how to stand still, how to listen without appearing to, how to exist without disturbing the delicate balance of a world that had already decided I did not quite fit into it. But here is the strange part, the part no one saw coming. They thought I was powerless. They thought I had no place, no claim, no voice that mattered. And for a while, well, I almost believed them, almost. Because what they didn't understand, what they never even considered, was that being invisible gives you something very few people in high society ever possess. Time to observe, time to learn, time to understand exactly how power moves, quietly, discreetly, behind closed doors and polite smiles. And once you understand that, truly understand it, you realize something dangerous. Power is not always where people think it is. Sometimes it's waiting in the hands of the person no one bothered to notice. So yes, they dismissed me, they underestimated me, they made their little jokes and their careful exclusions. And I let them. I let them believe I was nothing, because by the time they realized who I really was, it was already too late. Everything, every estate, every title, every carefully guarded fortune, it all came through me. And the most unsettling part, they had no one to blame but themselves. Because they were the ones who taught me how their world truly worked. And I listened. Oh, I listened very carefully. My name is Adelaide Fairley. Not a name that carried much weight when I first arrived in London society, I assure you. If anything, it raised questions, quiet ones, but persistent. Fairley, from where exactly? I would hear it whispered just behind me, followed by that same restrained curiosity dressed as politeness. I came to the city in the final years of the Edwardian era, when everything looked stable on the surface. Grand estates, elegant dinners, rules that had existed for generations. But beneath it all, there were cracks. You could feel them if you paid attention, and I did. I was brought into the Fairley connection through my late mother's distant relation to the Ashbourne family, an old, respected name with land, influence, and, more importantly, expectations, very specific expectations. I was not raised among them. I did not grow up learning which fork to use or how to navigate a drawing room conversation without revealing too much of myself. I learned those things later, carefully, quietly, by watching. When I first stepped into Ashbourne House, I remember thinking how impossibly large it felt. Not just in size, but in presence. Every room seemed to hold history, and every person inside it seemed to know exactly where they stood within that history. Everyone. Except me. I was placed somewhere undefined. Not quite family, certainly not a guest. Something in between, useful, perhaps tolerated, definitely. There were rules I was never explicitly told, yet constantly expected to follow. Speak, but not too much. Smile, but not too brightly. Exist, but do not draw attention, and I tried. I truly did. I adjusted my posture, softened my voice, measured my words. But there is something about not belonging that cannot be disguised, no matter how carefully you perform. They could sense it. It didn't take long for me to realize that being overlooked was only the beginning. There is a particular kind of isolation, reserved for those who exist within a system, but are never fully accepted by it. I was invited to dinners. Yes, I stood in drawing rooms, nodded at conversations, even shared the occasional polite exchange, but I was never included, not truly. There were moments, small, almost unnoticeable, when conversations would shift the instant I approached. Voices would lower, topics would change. And I would be left standing there, smiling faintly, pretending not to notice what had just happened. It's strange how quickly one learns to pretend. I told myself it didn't matter, that I was there for stability, for opportunity, for something better than the uncertain life I had left behind. But even then, I could feel something tightening, a quiet resistance growing beneath my composure. Lady Ashbourne made her position quite clear without ever needing to say it outright. She would assign me small tasks, harmless on the surface, but deliberate in their intention. Adelaide, Would you see to the correspondence? Adelaide, ensure the arrangements are in order. Always said with that same composed tone. Always in front of others. It was subtle but effective, a quiet reminder of where I stood, or rather, where I did not. And Frederick, well, Frederick's indifference began to feel almost strategic. He wasn't unkind. That would have been easier to understand. No. He simply treated me as though I were irrelevant, as though my presence had no consequence. And in a house where every glance, every word, every alliance carried meaning, that kind of indifference spoke volumes. Then there were the guests. The wider circle of society that moved through Ashbourne House like a carefully choreographed performance. They would greet me politely, of course. Ask vague questions about my background. Offer thin smiles that never quite reached their eyes. And then, inevitably, they would turn their attention elsewhere, to those who mattered, to those who belonged. I began to notice patterns. Who deferred to whom? Which families held quiet influence despite lacking titles? Which conversations carried weight? And which were merely decoration? At first I observed out of necessity, later I observed with intent. Because something shifted inside me during those long evenings of being overlooked, a realization, slow but undeniable. If I could not command attention in the way they did, then I would find another way, a quieter way, a more effective way. After all, invisibility has its advantages. People reveal themselves when they believe no one important is watching, and I was not important. Not in their eyes, but that gave me access to their habits, their assumptions, their weaknesses. I began to see the fractures beneath the elegance, the tensions between families, the unspoken anxieties surrounding inheritance, legacy, control. It was all there, high beneath layers of etiquette and carefully maintained appearances, and the more I saw, the more I understood. This world wasn't as stable as it pretended to be. It only appeared that way because everyone agreed to play their part. But what happens when someone refuses to remain in theirs? What happens when the outsider stops trying to belong and starts paying attention instead? That question stayed with me, quiet, unsettling. Because somewhere deep down AB was beginning to suspect that my place in that house was not as fixed as they believed. And perhaps not as powerless as I had once thought. The letter arrived on a grey morning, the kind where the sky seems undecided. Caught between rain and restraint, I almost wasn't meant to see it. It was placed among the usual stack of correspondence, formal invitations, financial updates, polite acknowledgements from distant relatives, routine things, predictable things. But this letter felt different the moment I touched it. Heavier, somehow, marked with a seal I didn't immediately recognize. I hesitated. Just for a moment, because in that house, boundaries were everything, even the unspoken ones. And this felt like something I wasn't meant to cross. But then again, I wasn't meant to belong there either, so I opened it carefully. Deliberately, the contents were brief, precise, and utterly unexpected. It was addressed to Lady Ashbourne, informing her of the declining health of a distant relative, Lord Holbrook, a man whose name I had only heard mentioned in passing, an old figure. Reclusive and, more importantly, extraordinarily wealthy. What caught my attention wasn't his condition, it was the next line, a request. No, not a request, a stipulation. He wished to review the succession of his estate, personally, and he had named those he intended to receive. I read that part twice, then a third time, because something about it didn't sit the way I expected. The names listed, they were not what one would assume. There were omissions, significant ones, and inclusions that made no immediate sense. I felt it then, that quiet shift, the kind that doesn't announce itself loudly, but settles into your awareness with undeniable weight. This wasn't just a matter of inheritance, this was disruption. A potential fracture in the very structure that families like the Ashburns relied upon. And suddenly, everything I had been observing, everything I had been quietly learning, it all felt relevant, important generously so. I folded the letter slowly, placing it back among the others, as though nothing had changed, but something had. I could feel it. Because for the first time since arriving at Ashbourne House, AB wasn't just watching the system. I was standing at the edge of something that could alter it. And the most unsettling thought of all? I wasn't sure whether I was meant to ignore it, or step closer, because if there was one thing I understood by then, It was this: opportunities in that world rarely announce themselves twice. And this one felt like the beginning of something far bigger than any of them realized, including me. I did not sleep that night. Not properly, anyway. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the letter again. The careful wording, the unexpected names, the quiet disruption it promised. It lingered in my thoughts like a question I couldn't quite answer, or perhaps one I wasn't ready to. Because the truth was, I shouldn't have opened it. I knew that in a house built on unspoken rules, I had crossed one. And yet, I didn't regret it, not entirely. That was the unsettling part. I lay there, staring into the dim outline of the ceiling. Turning the possibilities over and over in my mind. What if I said nothing? What if I simply allowed events to unfold as they were meant to, as they always had? It would be safer, cleaner. I would remain exactly what they believed me to be, an outsider, unimportant, untouched by the complications of power and inheritance. But then, another thought crept in, quieter but far more persistent. What if this was the moment? The one moment when everything I had observed, everything I had quietly learned, could actually matter. It felt dangerous to even consider it, because stepping closer meant risking exposure, risking the fragile position I had managed to maintain. I wasn't foolish. I understood the cost of miscalculation in that world. Reputation could be dismantled in a single conversation. Presence erased with nothing more than polite exclusion, and I had no foundation strong enough to withstand that, or so I believed. But still, the thought remained piercilled, unyielding. I had spent weeks, months, watching them, learning how influence moved beneath the surface, how decisions were shaped long before they were ever announced. And now, I was standing at the edge of something real, something that could shift the balance. The question was no longer whether I understood the system. The question was, would I use that understanding? I sat up then, pulling the covers aside as though the decision might be waiting somewhere just beyond them. Ridiculous, I know, but it felt necessary. Because for the first time since arriving at Ashbourne House, Abby wasn't reacting. I was choosing. And that realization, it was both terrifying and strangely empowering. I moved to the window, watching the faint light of morning begin to stretch across the grounds. Everything looked the same, calm, orderly, predictable. But beneath it, something had shifted. I could feel it, and perhaps they would feel it too. Eventually, I exhaled slowly, steadying myself. Because I knew one thing with absolute clarity: if I stepped forward, there would be no returning to the quiet safety of being overlooked. No slipping back into invisibility. I would be seen, measured, judged, and perhaps removed. But still, Abby found myself asking a different question. Not, what if I fail? But, what if this is the only chance I will ever have? And that was far more difficult to ignore. So I made a decision, not a loud one, not a dramatic declaration, just a quiet shift in intention. I would not interfere recklessly. But I would not remain passive either. I would observe more closely, listen more carefully, and when the moment revealed itself, Abby would act. Carefully, precisely, because if there was one thing I had learned in that house, it was that power did not belong to the loudest voice. It belonged to the one who understood when to speak, and when to wait. I met him 2 days later, though met might be too generous a word. It was more an interruption, an unexpected one. I had been in the smaller library, one of the quieter rooms in Ashbourne House, rarely used except for storage of older documents and correspondence. It suited me. Less attention, more space to think. I was reviewing a set of ledgers, nothing remarkable on the surface, just routine financial records, but I had begun to notice patterns, subtle inconsistencies, shifts in allocation, things that didn't quite align with the image the family presented publicly. I was focused, perhaps too focused, because I didn't hear him enter. Those won't tell you everything. His voice was calm, measured, but it carried a quiet certainty that made me look up immediately. He stood just inside the doorway, as though he had been there long enough to observe, but not long enough to interrupt. Until now, I closed the ledger slowly. I wasn't aware I was being observed. A simple response, carefully neutral. He stepped further into the room, his gaze moving briefly over the documents before returning to me. "Most people aren't," he said, almost thoughtfully. There was something about him, something that didn't quite fit within the usual patterns of the house. His posture was relaxed, but not careless. His expression composed, but not distant. And his eyes were paying attention to me, which in itself was unusual. "You've been going through records that aren't typically of interest to guests," he continued. There it was, the word guests. A subtle placement, but intentional. I tilted my head slightly. "And yet you haven't asked me to stop. A small risk." But I wanted to see how he would respond. A faint smile touched his expression. Not amusement exactly, but recognition. "No," he admitted. "I haven't." He moved closer, stopping just across the table from me. "Because I'm curious." That word lingered in the air between us, curious. Not judgmental, not dismissive, just interested. It was unfamiliar. "Curiosity can be dangerous," I said quietly. His gaze held mine. Steady and unflinching, so can underestimation. For a moment, neither of us spoke, and in that silence, something shifted, not dramatically, not obviously, but enough for me to realize that this was not a simple interaction. This was recognition. The kind that passes between two people who understand something without needing to say it outright. He extended a hand then, as though formalities suddenly mattered. "Thomas Halbrook." The name landed with weight because I recognized it immediately. Holbrook. The same name from the letter, the same name tied to the inheritance that had unsettled everything. I hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before taking his hand. Adelaide Fairley. His grip was firm, but not overpowering, deliberate. Like everything else about him. "Fairley," he repeated, as though testing the sound of it. Then, after a brief pause, "I suspect you've already realized that things in this house are not quite as stable as they appear." I didn't answer. 5 immediately, because in that moment, I understood something with quiet certainty. This was not coincidence. This was the beginning of something far more complex and far more dangerous, because Thomas Halbrook was not just another guest. He was connected directly to the very shift I had been contemplating, and somehow he already knew I was paying attention. The question was, why? And perhaps more importantly, what did he intend to do about it? I did not trust him, not at first. In a house like Ashbourne, trust was not given. It was measured, tested, and often misplaced. And yet, I didn't avoid him either. That would have been the safer choice. But something about Thomas Halbrook made safe feel insufficient. We began, strangely enough, with conversations that appeared entirely ordinary, brief exchanges in the corridors, a few words at dinner, polite observations that revealed nothing, and yet, somehow, everything. "You notice more than you say," he told me once, almost casually, as we stood near the terrace doors. I glanced at him just briefly. "And you say more than most people realize." A pause, then that same faint, knowing expression. "Perhaps," he admitted. It became a pattern after that, small conversations, quiet ones, always just on the edge of something deeper, and slowly, very slowly, I began to understand his position. Thomas was not simply connected to Lord Halbrook. He was his nephew, not the most obvious heir, not the one society had already chosen in its silent predictions, but present-volved, observing, just like me. And that similarity, it created something unexpected, a kind of alignment. We spoke one evening in the library again, the same room where we had first encountered one another. Only this time, the distance between us felt different, less guarded. "Do you believe inheritance is ever truly fair?" he asked, leaning slightly against the table. I considered the question. "Fairness implies intention," I said. "Inheritance is rarely about fairness, it's about control." His eyes sharpened slightly. "Control of what?" "Legacy," I replied, "and perception." That seemed to interest him more than I expected. "Most people would say money." I shook my head faintly. "Money is the tool, not the objective." There was a moment then, a quiet recognition. The kind that confirms you are speaking to someone who understands the same unspoken rules. After that, our conversations shifted. They became intentional. We spoke of family structures, of influence, of how decisions were shaped long before they were ever revealed. And gradually, almost without realizing it, we began to share information carefully, measured, never everything at once, but enough. Enough to build something resembling trust, or perhaps something more strategic than trust. "I think my uncle intends to disrupt expectations," Thomas said one evening, his tone lower than usual. I didn't react immediately. Based on what? I asked. Based on who he's choosing to involve, he replied, a subtle answer, but I understood it. For because I had seen the same thing, the names in that letter, they weren't random, they were deliberate, calculated, and potentially divisive. Then the question isn't what he intends, I said quietly. It's why. Thomas studied me for a moment. And what do you think? I hesitated. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because I wasn't sure how much to reveal. Finally, I said, I think he's testing people. A silence followed, not uncomfortable, just thoughtful. And if he is? Thomas asked. Then the outcome won't depend on inheritance, I replied. It will depend on who understands the test. Our eyes met then. And in that moment, something settled between us, not trust exactly, but alignment, a shared awareness. We were both outsiders to expectation. Both overlooked in different ways. And now, both standing at the edge of something that could reshape everything. The difference was, we were no longer observing alone, and that changed the nature of the game entirely. It's a strange thing. Realizing you are no longer alone in a place where you've always felt isolated. At first I resisted it. That sense of ease when Thomas was near, the way conversations felt less performative, more real, I told myself it was strategic. That aligning with him simply made sense. That it was about information, positioning, understanding the shifting structure around us. And perhaps, at the beginning it was, but something changed, quickly, gradually. The shift came one evening after dinner. The house had settled into that familiar rhythm, low conversations fading into the distance, footsteps soft against polished floors. I stepped out onto the terrace, needing space, air, something beyond the carefully controlled environment inside. I didn't expect him to follow. But he did. You disappear often, he said lightly, stepping beside me. I gave a faint smile. I find it easier to think when I'm not being observed. He let out a quiet breath. Is that what you believe? I glanced at him. What do you mean? That you're not being observed, he clarified. There was something in his tone. Not challenging, not dismissive, just aware. I looked away, out toward the darkened gardens. Perhaps not, I admitted. A pause settled between us, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt honest. You're not what they think you are, he said after a moment. The words were simple, but they carried weight. Because they weren't flattery, they were recognition. I exhaled slowly. And what do they think I am? He didn't hesitate. Temporary. That word landed harder than I expected, because it was true, not just in their eyes, but in the way I had begun to see myself. A placeholder, an addition that could be removed without consequence. And what do you think? I asked, quieter now. He turned slightly toward me. I think you're paying attention in a way that makes people uncomfortable, even if they don't realize why. I felt something shift then. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just real. Because for the first time since arriving at Ashbourne House, someone saw me. 5, not as an outsider trying to belong, not as an inconvenience to be managed, but as someone who understood. And that mattered more than I expected. I didn't plan for any of this, I said, almost to myself. The observation. The involvement, he nodded slightly. Neither did I. Another pause, then quieter, but here we are. I let out a small breath. Something close to a laugh, though softer. Yes, I said, here we are. And in that moment, something settled between us, not just alignment. Not just strategy, something steadier, more human, a sense that whatever this was, whatever was coming, we would not face it entirely alone. And that realization, it changed everything. Because power, I was beginning to understand, was not only about control or influence. Sometimes it was about connection, the right one at the right moment, even if it complicated everything that came after. It didn't take long for the atmosphere inside Ashbourne House to change. At first it was subtle, a shift in tone. Conversations that lingered just a second too long on certain subjects, then stopped abruptly when someone unfamiliar drew near. But then it became undeniable. The letter had done its work, word spread quietly, never openly discussed, of course, but in that world, silence often carried more meaning than speech. Lord Halbrook was reviewing his inheritance, personally. And suddenly everyone was paying attention. Lady Ashbourne in particular became sharper, more attentive, not to me, no. That would have been too obvious. but to everything around her. Every interaction was measured, every conversation carefully navigated. I noticed the way she began to watch Thomas. Not directly, never directly, but with a subtle awareness that hadn't been there before. Frederick, too, seemed unsettled. His usual indifference gave way to something quieter, more controlled, as though he were recalculating his position without quite knowing how. And the guests, well, they transformed entirely. What had once been polite society gatherings became something else. Strategic, every smile carried intention, every word, weight. It was almost fascinating to watch, almost because the closer I looked, the more I realized something uncomfortable. This wasn't just about inheritance, it was about legitimacy, about who deserved to hold power and who merely appeared to. And suddenly, the rules felt less stable than ever. Thomas and I spoke less openly during this time. Not because the connection between us had weakened, but because the stakes had grown. Every conversation now carried risk. Every association implication. "You've noticed it," he said quietly one afternoon, as we crossed paths in the corridor. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I replied, a brief pause. "They're repositioning," I added. He gave a faint nod. "So are we." That word again, we. It should have felt reassuring, but instead, it made everything feel more real, because we implied involvement. And involvement meant consequence. The tension reached its peak during a dinner hosted by Lady Ashbourne herself, a carefully assembled gathering. Influential families, key figures, people who mattered. I took my place at the table as I always did, present but peripheral. Or at least, that was the expectation. But something felt different that evening. The conversations were tighter, more deliberate. And then, it happened, a question directed not at Lady Ashbourne, not at Frederick, but at Thomas. A simple inquiry on the surface, about his connection to Lord Holbrook, but beneath it, a challenge. A test. The room shifted subtly, but unmistakably, and for a brief moment, all attention turned toward him, toward the possibility he represented. I watched carefully, because this was what everything had been building toward. And in that moment, I realized something that sent a quiet chill through me. The game had already begun, whether we acknowledged it or not, and the outcome, it would not be decided by tradition or expectation. It would be decided by those who understood how to move within the uncertainty, and perhaps more dangerously, those who were willing to. The revelation didn't come loudly. There was no grand announcement, no dramatic declaration in front of the entire household. It came quietly, almost privately, which I suppose made it far more powerful. Thomas found me in the library again. It seemed to be our place, where conversations could exist without immediate consequence. "You were right," he said without preamble. I looked up from the book I wasn't truly reading. "About what, my uncle?" he replied. "He is testing people." I closed the book slowly. I assumed as much. He stepped closer, his expression more serious than I had seen before. "It's more than that," he said. That caught my attention. "How so?" A brief hesitation. Then, "He's not just observing from a distance." Something in his tone made my pulse quicken slightly. "What do you mean?" Thomas held my gaze. "He's coming here." For a moment, I didn't respond because that changed everything. Lord Holbrook, reclusive, distant, powerful, entering Ashbourne House. It wasn't just unusual, it was disruptive. "Why?" I asked, quieter now. "Because he doesn't trust second-hand information," Thomas said. "He wants to see for himself." The weight of that settled immediately. Because if Lord Holbrook was coming, then every action, every interaction, every decision, it would be observed, evaluated, judged. And suddenly, the quiet strategies, the subtle positioning, it all felt far more exposed. "When?" I asked. "Soon," Thomas replied. "Within the week." A silence followed, not empty, but heavy with implication, because we both understood what this meant. The test was no longer theoretical, it was immediate, real, and dangerously close. "There's something else," Thomas added. I looked at him again. "What?" He hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. Then, "The inheritance isn't structured the way they believe." That was unexpected. "In what way?" He exhaled slightly, as though choosing his words carefully. "It's conditional." The word echoed in my mind. Conditional. "On what?" I asked. "On judgment," he said. "On capability. on alignment with his expectations. I felt a shift then, a deeper one, because this wasn't just about who was related to whom. This was about who proved themselves worthy. And in a system built on tradition and entitlement, that kind of disruption was dangerous. Then the outcome isn't predetermined, I said slowly. No, Thomas agreed. It isn't. Another silence, but this one felt different, sharper. More focused, because suddenly the possibilities had expanded, and so had the risks. Do they know? I asked. He shook his head faintly. Not fully. Of course they didn't. They were operating on assumption, on expectation. On the belief that inheritance followed a predictable path, but now that path had fractured, and in that fracture, there was opportunity. Real opportunity, the kind that rarely appeared, and never lasted long. I stood slowly, my thoughts moving faster than I could fully contain. This changes everything, I said. Thomas watched me carefully. Yes, he said. It does. And in that moment, I understood something with absolute clarity. This was no longer about observation or quiet understanding. This was about action, because when the man who controlled everything chose to step into the room, there would be no hiding. No remaining invisible. Only those who adapted would remain standing. And for the first time, Abby wasn't just considering that possibility. I was preparing for it. When Lord Halbrook arrived, the house changed overnight. Not visibly. Not in the way one might expect, but in something quieter, more controlled. Even the air felt measured. He was not an imposing man in the traditional sense, no raised voice, no dramatic presence, and yet, when he entered a room, everything adjusted. Conversation straightened, postures corrected, attention shifted, effortlessly, almost instinctively, toward him. I watched carefully. Of course I did, because this was the man at the center of everything. The one whose decision would reshape the entire structure surrounding us. And he noticed things, not just the obvious, the subtle. The overlooked, the things others assumed didn't matter, which meant I had to be precise, every movement, every word, every silence. It was exhausting and strangely exhilarating. The first time he spoke directly to me, it wasn't planned, at least not on my part. I had been assisting with correspondence again. Something Lady Ashbourne now assigned with more frequency, though I could sense her growing unease. He approached quietly. You handle these often, he asked. I turned, just slightly. Frequently enough, I replied. A pause. Then, you read them carefully. There it was, the question beneath the question. I met his gaze. Yes, I said, not defensive, not eager. Just honest. He studied me for a moment, long enough to feel the weight of it. And what do you look for? I could have given a simple answer. A safe one, but something told me that would not serve me here. Intention, I said. Another pause, subtle but significant. And do you often find it, he asked. More often than people realize, I replied. Silence then, very faintly. He nodded, not approval. Not quite, but acknowledgement, and in that moment I understood something. I had been seen. Not as an outsider, not as an afterthought, but as someone relevant. The shift was immediate, not outwardly. No one rushed to treat me differently, but I felt it. In the way conversations no longer dismissed my presence so quickly, in the way certain remarks paused, as though reconsidered. Even Lady Ashbourne began to watch me differently, carefully, as though trying to understand something she had previously overlooked. Thomas noticed it too. You've moved, he said quietly later that evening. I frowned slightly. Moved in position, he clarified. A small pause. You're no longer invisible. I exhaled slowly. No, I admitted, I'm not. And that should have felt like victory. It did. In part, because everything I had observed, everything I had prepared for, it was working. I had stepped into the game, and I was holding my ground. But there was something else beneath it, something quieter, more uncertain. 5. Because visibility comes with consequence, and for the first time Abby could feel the weight of that still. It was a victory, a small one, perhaps temporary but real, and in that world, even the smallest shift in perception could change everything. The fall didn't happen all at once. It never does. It begins with something small, something almost insignificant. A conversation, slightly altered, a glance, held just a moment too long, a question, asked with more intention than before. At first, I thought I was imagining it, the subtle change in how I was being regarded, but then, it became undeniable. Lady Ashbourne summoned me one afternoon, not unusual, but the tone was different, sharper, controlled in a way that suggested something beneath it. "Adelaide," she said, motioning for me to sit. I remained standing. "I prefer to stand, if you don't mind." A small defiance, but deliberate. Her eyes narrowed, just slightly. "Very well." A pause. Then, "You've been quite visible lately." There it was, not an accusation, not directly, but close enough. "I've simply been fulfilling my duties," I replied. Careful, measured, her gaze didn't waver. Duties can be interpreted in many ways. A quiet tension settled in the room, because this wasn't about tasks. It wasn't about correspondence or presence, it was about position. And she knew it. "You've spoken with Lord Halbrook," she continued. Not a question, a statement. "Yes," I said. No hesitation, that would have been worse. "And what impression do you believe you've made?" There it was again, the test beneath the conversation. I chose my words carefully. That would be for him to determine. Her lips pressed together slightly, not anger. Something more controlled than that, displeasure. "You would do well to remember your place," she said quietly. The words were calm, but the meaning unmistakable. And for a brief moment, Abby felt it, that old sensation of being reduced, of being reminded that no matter how much I observed, how much I understood, there were still those who believed I did not belong. But this time, something in me resisted. "I remember it very clearly," I said softly, but firmly. A silence followed. And in that silence, something shifted, not in my favor, not this time. Because I had crossed a line, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough for her to see me not as a temporary inconvenience, but as something else, something disruptive. The consequences came quickly, subtle but effective. My access to certain rooms became limited. Conversations I had once been near now excluded me entirely. Even the correspondence I had managed was reassigned. Piece by piece, my position was being dismantled carefully, strategically, and I understood exactly why, because I had been seen. And in that house, being seen without permission was dangerous. Thomas found me later that evening. "You felt it," he said, "Agan." Not a question. "Yes," I replied, a pause. "They're closing ranks," he nodded slightly. "They're threatened." I let out a quiet breath. Then I miscalculated. He shook his head. "No," he said. "You revealed yourself. A subtle difference, but an important one." Still, the result was the same. I had lost ground, significant ground, and the worst part? Lord Halbrook was still watching. Which meant every move from this point forward would matter even more, because now AB was no longer underestimated. I was something far more dangerous in their eyes. A variable, and variables are rarely tolerated for long. I spent that night in complete silence, not because I had nothing to think about, but because there was too much. Every move I had made replayed in my mind, each one sharper than the last. Where had I pushed too far? Where had I revealed too much? And more importantly, what now? Because retreat was still an option. I could step back, accept the quiet dismissal, allow myself to fade once more into the background where expectations were low and consequences minimal. It would be safer, simpler, predictable. But as I sat there, staring at the faint glow of candlelight, I realized something that unsettled me more than any setback. I didn't want that anymore, not the invisibility, not the quiet acceptance of being overlooked. I had seen too much, understood too much. And once you see how power truly moves, you cannot pretend not to. The question wasn't whether I could go back, the question was whether I would. I stood slowly, pacing the room, as though movement might clarify what still felt uncertain. Lady Ashbourne had made her position clear. The house had responded accordingly. The system was correcting itself, pushing me back into place, and if I allowed it, it would succeed. That was the truth, but there was another truth beneath it, less comfortable, far more dangerous. The system only works if everyone agrees to follow it. I stopped then, because that thought, it changed everything. What if I didn't? Not recklessly, not impulsively, but deliberately. What if, instead of trying to regain my previous position, AB redefined it entirely? The idea felt almost impossible at first. Who was I to challenge a structure that had existed for generations? Who was I to step beyond the boundaries that had been so carefully maintained? And yet, who better, because I was never truly part of it? I had nothing to preserve, no legacy to protect, no expectations to uphold. Only opportunity. I let out a slow breath, steadying myself. Because I understood the cost. This would not be subtle, not entirely. It would require precision, timing, and a willingness to be seen in a way I had avoided until now. And if I failed, there would be no quiet recovery, no second chance. But if I succeeded, everything could change, not just for me. But for the structure itself, I moved to the desk, my fingers resting lightly against its surface as my thoughts finally settled into something clear, focused, intentional. I would not fight them directly. That would be foolish. They were too established, too entrenched. Instead, AB would align with something greater, something they could not easily dismiss. Lord Halbrook, the source of the disruption. The one person whose judgment now outweighed tradition itself. If the system was shifting, then I would not resist it. I would step into that shift fully, deliberately, and I would make myself undeniable, not through defiance, but through value. Through understanding, through the very thing they had overlooked from the beginning. I straightened slightly, the decision settling into me with a quiet certainty. This was no longer about reclaiming a place, it was about creating one. And once that thought took hold, there was no turning back, because the next time they looked at me, they would not see an outsider. They would see someone who had chosen her position, and intended to keep it. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. It always does. When you're finally ready to act, Lord Halbrook requested a private review of estate records, not unusual given the circumstances. But what was unusual was who he asked to assist, not Lady Ashbourne, not Frederick. Me. The room shifted the moment the request was announced. Not visibly. No one reacted openly, but I felt it, the tension, the disbelief, the quiet resistance. And for the first time, I did not shrink from it. I stepped forward calm, composed, certain. The study was smaller than the main rooms, but heavier in presence. This was where decisions were made, where appearances were set aside, where truth mattered more than presentation. Lord Halbrook was already seated when I entered. He didn't look up immediately, just gestured faintly toward the documents. Let's begin. No formalities, no unnecessary words. I moved to the table, arranging the records with careful precision. For a moment, neither of us spoke then. You've been restricted recently, he said, just like that, direct, observant. I didn't deny it. Yes, a pause. And yet, you're here. I met his gaze. Yes, another pause, longer this time, as though he were weighing something unseen. Tell me, he said finally, what do you believe is the greatest weakness in a house like this? It was the question. The one everything had been building toward, and I knew this was the moment. The decision I had made now required action. I could answer carefully, safely, offer something acceptable, something expected, or AB could be honest, completely. I exhaled slowly, then spoke. Assumption, I said. His expression didn't change, but his attention sharpened. They assume continuity, I continued. That roles will remain fixed, that loyalty follows structure, that power belongs to those who have always held it. A silence settled heavy. Intentional. And you believe that's incorrect, he asked. I believe it's fragile, I replied. A slight shift, almost imperceptible. Explain. I steadied myself, because this was everything. Power isn't sustained by tradition alone, I said. It requires awareness. Adaptation. The ability to recognize when the structure no longer serves its purpose. I paused, just briefly. And this house has stopped adapting. The words hung in the air, clear, unavoidable. There was no retreat from them now, no softening, no correction, just truth. And consequence, Lord Halbrook studied me for a long moment. Long enough that I could feel the weight of what I had just risked. Then, slowly, he leaned back. And what would you suggest? He asked. There it was, not dismissal, not rejection, an opening, and I stepped into it. I would suggest that inheritance should not reinforce stagnation, I said. It should correct it. A silence followed. But this one felt different, not tense, not uncertain. Something else, something decided. Lord Halbrook nodded once, a small gesture. But final. I see, he said, and that was it. No praise, no confirmation, just those two words, but I understood. Because in that moment, everything shifted, not visibly, not immediately, but undeniably. I had stepped beyond observation, beyond strategy. U5 into influence, real influence, and the most remarkable part, I hadn't forced it, I hadn't demanded it. I had simply made myself impossible to ignore, and in a world built on perception, that was the most powerful move of all. The change did not arrive with applause, no announcement, no formal acknowledgement placed neatly before the household. That would have been too obvious, too direct for a world that preferred its power shifts quiet and controlled, but it happened slowly at first. Then all at once, I felt it in the way doors no longer closed as quickly when I approached, in the way conversations paused, not to exclude me, but to consider whether I should be included. That was new consideration. It sounds small, but in that house it meant everything. Lady Ashbourne's tone changed, not warmer, never that, but measured differently, careful. As though she were no longer entirely certain how far her authority extended where I was concerned. And Frederick, he began to look at me. Not oft enough. Enough to suggest that I was no longer invisible in his calculations, which in its own way was a form of respect. Or perhaps caution. Thomas noticed it before I said anything. "You've altered the balance," he said quietly. Standing beside me near the staircase one morning, I allowed myself the smallest pause. "Have I?" He gave a faint, almost amused breath. "You know you have." I didn't deny it because I could feel it too, not just around me, but within me. The hesitation that once shaped my movements, it had faded, not entirely, but enough, replaced by something steadier, something more certain. "I didn't expect it to feel like this," I admitted. He glanced at me. "And how does it feel?" I considered the question carefully, because the answer wasn't simple. "It feels." I paused, searching for the right word. "Permanent." That seemed to settle between us. Because permanence, in a world built on shifting alliances and fragile reputations, was rare. "And is that what you wanted?" he asked. Another pause. Then, "No," I said honestly. "It's more than I expected." And that was the truth. I had set out to understand the system, to navigate it, to survive within it. But this was something else entirely. I wasn't just within the structure anymore. I was part of what shaped it, and with that came something I hadn't fully prepared for: responsibility. Because influence, once gained, demands to be maintained not through force, but through consistency, awareness, choice. I could feel the expectations shifting around me, not spoken, not declared, but present. What would I do next? How would I act now that I had been seen? I exhaled slowly, steadying myself, because I understood something now that I hadn't before. Transformation isn't a moment, it's a continuation, a series of decisions that define not just how others see you, but how you see yourself. And for the first time, Abby no longer saw an outsider trying to belong. I saw someone who had created her place and intended to hold it. Not by imitation, not by permission, but by understanding something the others had overlooked. Power doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives quietly and stays because no one can quite figure out how to take it away. Years have a way of softening details, but sharpening meaning. When I look back now, the sequence of events feels almost inevitable. Though I know, at the time, it was anything but. Lord Halbrook's final decisions were not announced immediately. He took his time, observed longer than anyone expected, allowed the house to settle, and then shift again. But when the outcome came, it was decisive. The inheritance was divided, but not in the way tradition would have dictated. Positions were reassigned, influence distributed, responsibility placed where it had not existed before. And my name appeared where no one had anticipated, not at the top. Not in a way that would provoke open resistance, but strategically, deliberately. I was given oversight, not ownership, not entirely, but something far more: flexible control of certain estates, involvement in decisions that shaped the future of the family's standing. At first, there was confusion, then resistance, quiet of course, always quiet, but it didn't last because Lord Halbrook's authority was unquestioned. And more importantly, his reasoning was undeniable, the structure adapted, it had no choice. And in that adaptation, something changed permanently. The idea that power must follow lineage alone, it weakened not completely, but enough. Enough for new considerations to emerge: capability, awareness, understanding. Concepts that had once been secondary now carried weight. As for Ashbourne House, It endured, it always does, but it was different, subtly, irreversibly. The rigid lines that once defined every role had softened, not erased, but altered. And within that change, Abby found my place not just maintained, but expanded. Thomas remained, a constant, not always beside me. Not always in agreement, but present, aligned in ways that mattered. We built something, not formal, not defined by the expectations around us, but understood, a partnership shaped by shared perspective rather than obligation. And over time, that proved more stable than anything tradition could have imposed. Looking back, I realize something now that I couldn't fully see then. The inheritance was never just about wealth, or land, or title. It was about transition, about testing whether a system could evolve, without collapsing under its own resistance, and somehow, it did, not perfectly, but sufficiently. Because those who adapted remained, and those who didn't faded quietly, as these things often happen, and I remained. Not as the outsider they once dismissed, but as something far more difficult to define, a presence, a constant, a reminder that power, once understood, does not easily return to where it once belonged. By the time the last of the winter frost melted from the estate gardens, I had already decided how it would end, not in scandal, not in shouting, not even in revenge, but in truth, delivered so precisely, so undeniably, that no one could ever twist it again. The solicitor, Mr. Holbrook, had written to confirm that the final accounting of the estate would be presented in person. All beneficiaries, trustees, and interested parties were expected to attend. That meant everyone would be there. Aunt Margaret, Edward, Clara. Even distant cousins who had once ignored my existence. They would sit in that grand drawing room, the very one where I had once stood invisible, and they would listen. This time, they would not be able to look away. The morning of the gathering arrived cold and sharp. I dressed with deliberate care, not extravagantly, not to impress, but to declare, a deep charcoal gown, tailored perfectly to my frame. No frills, no lace, just clean lines and quiet authority. My hair was pinned neatly, my posture unyielding. I did not look like a servant. I did not look like an outsider. I looked like a woman who owned her place, and for the first time in that house, I truly did. When I entered the drawing room, conversation faltered. It was subtle, a hesitation, a shift, but I felt it. They noticed. Of course they did. Aunt Margaret sat rigidly near the fireplace, her lips pressed thin. Edward stood beside her, his expression carefully neutral, but I saw the tension in his jaw. Clara, seated elegantly near the window, looked almost amused. They still believed they understood the game. They still believed they had control. That was their final mistake. Miss Ashford, Mr. Holbrook greeted, inclining his head with newfound respect, not politeness, respect. Shall we begin? I nodded and took my seat, not at the edge of the room as I once would have, but at the table itself, across from them, equal. The documents were laid out, the air grew still, and then Mr. Holbrook began. The estate of the late Lord Ashford, he said, adjusting his spectacles, has undergone a thorough review in accordance with the terms of the will and subsequent legal inquiries. A pause. Then, certain discrepancies have come to light. Aunt Margaret stiffened. Edward's eyes flicked toward the solicitor. Clara's smile faded, just slightly. Specifically, Mr. Holbrook continued, evidence has been presented indicating attempts to interfere with the proper execution of the will, including the concealment of relevant clauses. Silence heavy, unavoidable. I did not speak. I did not need to. The evidence spoke for me. The letters, the witness statements, the carefully documented inconsistencies, all of it laid bare. Aunt Margaret rose abruptly. This is absurd, she snapped. There must be some mistake. There is no mistake, Mr. Holbrook replied calmly. Edward stepped forward. This is a misunderstanding, he insisted. Surely we can resolve this privately. No, I said. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a blade. Every eye turned to me. I met Edward's gaze first, then Aunt Margaret's, then Clara's, one by one. No more private arrangements, I continued. No more quiet manipulations. Everything will be addressed here and now. A flicker of something passed across Clara's face, not arrogance, not amusement. Something closer to unease. Mr. Holbrook cleared his throat. As a result of these findings, he said, the original terms of the will be enforced in full. Miss Ashford's position as primary beneficiary and acting controller of the estate is hereby confirmed, without contest." The words settled over the room like a verdict, final, irrevocable. Edward exhaled sharply. Aunt Margaret sank back into her chair, her composure cracking for the first time. Clara remained still, too still. And furthermore, the solicitor added, "Those found to have attempted interference may be subject to legal consequences, pending further review." That was when the fear truly appeared. Not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. I stood slowly, the room seemed to hold its breath. "I did not come here to destroy anyone," I said. And it was the truth. I came here to claim what was mine, and to ensure that no one else would be silenced the way I was. My gaze lingered on Aunt Margaret. Then Edward, then Clara. "You had every opportunity to act with fairness," I continued. "You chose otherwise." A pause, a single breath. "I will not make the same mistake." Silence. No one argued, no one protested, because for the first time they had nothing left to stand on. The meeting ended not with chaos, but with quiet defeat. The estate felt different after that day, not because the walls had changed, but because the truth had. People spoke to me differently. Staff who had once barely acknowledged my presence now met my gaze with respect. Decisions that had once been made behind closed doors were now brought directly to me, not out of obligation, but because they understood. I was the one who decided. Even Aunt Margaret changed, not entirely, not suddenly, but noticeably. There were no more cutting remarks, no more subtle exclusions, only a careful, measured distance. She had learned, at last, that I was not someone she could dismiss. Edward avoided me at first, then, gradually, he began to reappear, always polite, always restrained. But different. There was no arrogance left in him, only something quieter, regret perhaps. "You've changed," he said one afternoon. As we crossed paths in the gallery, I regarded him calmly. "No," I replied. "I've simply stopped allowing others to decide who I am." He nodded slowly, as though the answer settled something within him. Clara, however, was the most intriguing. She did not retreat, she did not apologize, but she did adapt. "You played the game well," she said one evening, joining me uninvited in the library. "I didn't play," I replied. "I endured." A faint smile touched her lips. Endurance is often the most dangerous strategy of all. We studied one another in silence, not enemies, not allies, something more complicated. "You could have destroyed us," she said after a moment. "I still could," I answered. Her smile deepened just slightly. "Yes," she said. "That's what makes this interesting." And then she left. Just like that. For a long time, I stood there, considering her words. Not because they unsettled me, but because they confirmed something I had already begun to understand. Power was not in shouting, not in forcing, not in proving. It was in knowing. Knowing your worth, knowing your place, knowing that no one else could define either for you. I walked through the estate that evening, as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the gardens. The same gardens where I had once walked unseen, the same paths where I had once felt small. But not anymore. I paused near the edge of the lawn, looking back at the house, at the windows, at the life within them. They had once treated me as an outsider, an afterthought, a shadow. Now, I was the center, not because I demanded it, but because I had earned it. And for the first time, I did not feel the need to prove anything to anyone. I simply turned and walked forward.